I've told this story to exactly two people. The first was my daughter, and she listened the way people listen when they love you but can't quite follow you, nodding and quiet and kind. The second time I'm telling it now, to whoever's willing to sit with it. What I can tell you is that 31 hours after Denny Aldrich walked off a Blue Ridge trail and disappeared into the kind of November that takes people, I found him sitting up, unhurt, breathing slow and even, with a careful arrangement of sticks placed all around him like someone had meant to build him a house, and then thought better of it. He was warm, he was calm. He looked at me the way a man looks when he's been kept company through the night, and isn't surprised to see the morning come. I need to go back a few days to explain why what I saw beside those sticks meant anything beyond the ordinary strangeness of a lucky rescue, because on its own, it was strange enough. But there was something else there that I recognized, and that recognition is what I've been carrying ever since. 3 years before that search, I lost my wife, Ruth. We were married 24 years. She went fast, which people said was a mercy, and maybe they were right. But fast doesn't mean it lands soft. It lands the way a roof collapses, all at once, and you're standing in a house with no ceiling looking up at weather you weren't ready for. The estrangement from my brother Marsh started around the same time. There was a decision near the end of Ruth's illness about whether to move her to a facility 40 minutes away or keep her home with us. I made a call. Marsh thought it was the wrong one. We said things, the way people do when grief hasn't arrived yet, but fear is running full volume. And after the service, we stopped calling. Not with a fight exactly. More like we both stopped picking up, and then we stopped trying. And 3 years went by in that silence. I joined the county search and rescue unit about 8 months after Ruth died. A neighbor who'd been on the team for years mentioned they needed volunteers, said the training wasn't complicated, said it gave his weekends a shape. That last part was the piece I needed. My weekends had no shape anymore. My mornings had no shape. The whole week had a texture like undrained dishwater, flat and grey and slightly cold. The county unit in our part of Western North Carolina is a volunteer outfit under emergency management. They train you in grid search and hasty protocol, compass bearings, radio procedure, subject psychology, how lost people move. I took the training seriously because that's how I do things. I'd worked 20 years as a diesel mechanic, and that trade teaches you that the way a thing is done either holds or it doesn't. You torque a fitting to spec or you don't. You follow procedure or you're guessing. I liked search and rescue for the same reason I liked the shop. There was a right way to do it. I brought Biscuit along almost from the start. He's a 7-year-old beagle, brown and white, named by Ruth for a reason she thought was obvious and I never questioned. He's not certified, not trained to any formal standard, and I want to be straight about that. I told the team coordinator the first time I brought him that he was a scent dog, in the same way I was a chef because I could make soup. She laughed and said she'd take any nose she could get. Biscuit has a better nose than mine by a factor I can't calculate, and he has the patience of someone who has never once in his life made a decision he regretted. He put his chin on my leg the night Ruth died and stayed there until morning, and I've trusted him more than most people since. The call about Denny Aldrich came in on a Wednesday, 2 hours after a group of day hikers on the Greer Ridge Trail system reported a man who'd separated from the group near a branching point and hadn't returned to the trailhead. The team coordinator, a woman named Carol who'd been running the unit for 11 years, gave us the grid assignments at the staging area, a gravel pull-out off a county road where the bare maples stood with their arms up against a sky that couldn't decide between grey and white. November, early, low 40s by afternoon, lower at night. The kind of weather that gives you about 36 hours of margin with a healthy person who has good layers, and much less if they're moving wrong. Denny was 67 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Asheville who hiked these trails every season. His group said he'd been in good spirits, was wearing a layered fleece and a shell over that, had a water bottle and a small day pack. He knew the trail system in a general way, but not in the specific way you need when you leave the marked path. The group had gone back when he didn't reappear at the split, and by the time they reached the trailhead and made the call, he'd already been missing for 3 hours. Carol assigned me and Biscuit the North Quadrant, approximately 4 miles of trail, with fingers of ridge running down into creek bottoms on either side. It was not the most likely quadrant. A lost hiker moving on instinct tends to follow downhill drainage, and the southern and eastern quadrants were denser with those routes. The North Quadrant was rockier, higher, quieter. I took it without comment and set out. The first hours of a search have a particular quality I've grown familiar with over 2 seasons. You are moving with purpose. Your attention is wide open, and your mind is simultaneously running every piece of subject information you've been given and cataloguing everything your senses pick up in the field. Wind direction, sound, the way the leaves have been pressed into the mud by a boot or haven't. The difference between a deer trail and a person trail, which is mostly about height and direction of bent vegetation. I called Denny's name at regular intervals, the way protocol requires, and I listened after each call with my whole body, not just my ears. Biscuit worked the undergrowth with the focused economy he always brings to it. He's not showy about what he does. He puts his nose down, and he reads what's there, and every few minutes he'd angle back to check on me with one eye, then put his nose back down. He found where Denny had left the trail. I'm reasonably confident of that because about 2.5 miles in, Biscuit stopped at a place where the marked path curved west and the ridge dropped away to the north, and he stood at that edge with his tail at a specific height I've learned to pay attention to. Not alarm, not excitement, steady interest. He was reading something. I marked the position on my GPS unit, radioed Carol with a possible deviation point, and followed Biscuit into the brush. We didn't find Denny that afternoon. The North Quadrant was slow going once you left the trail. Rock outcrops and laurel thickets and the kind of footing that costs you 20 minutes per quarter mile. By last light, I was back at base camp with nothing to report except Biscuit's point of interest, and Carol logged it for the morning. Base camp at night on a search has its own particular silence. The radio traffic thins out. The other volunteers eat and sleep in their vehicles, or in the small canvas shelter the county kit provides. I set up my 2-person tent at the edge of the pullout and made camp coffee on my small stove. And I did what I have done every morning and evening since Ruth died, which is set a cup on the flat rock beside my stove. Full cup for me. Empty cup beside it. I want to be careful about how I describe this habit because I don't want it to sound more considered than it was. It started the morning after the funeral because I made 2 cups by reflex and couldn't figure out what to do with the second one, so I set it there on the kitchen counter and let it sit until it went cold. And then I poured it out. After that, it became something I did without thinking too hard about why. On search deployments, I'd taken to using a flat rock near wherever I was camped as the surface. It was not a shrine. It was not a ritual in the formal sense. It was closer to the way a man keeps a chair at the table for someone who isn't coming to dinner, because stopping feels worse than continuing. I sat with my coffee and the empty cup and the dark edge of the tree line maybe 40 feet away, and something in the quality of that edge was wrong. I want to be precise here because the wrongness was not dramatic. It was not a sound. It was the absence of a sound I'd been registering without registering it, the small nighttime movements of the woods settling into cold, twigs and small animals, and the particular work of wind in dry leaves. All of that had stopped, Not all at once in the way noise stops when something alarming enters the picture. Gradually, the way a room empties when someone uncomfortable comes in and people drift toward other rooms without deciding to. My first explanation was the temperature. When it drops fast, the small mammals go still and den up, and that stillness can ripple through a nighttime woods the way a stone ripples a pond. I've seen it before. Cold settling, I told myself, and I finished my coffee. My second explanation was that I was tired. You hear differently when you're tired. You overread and underread alternately, sometimes in the same minute. I'd been on my feet since before dawn, and it was past 9 at night, and I was running on camp coffee and a sandwich I'd eaten standing up at the truck. Tired ears, I told myself. I poured out the cold second cup, as I always did, and went to bed. In the morning, I was awake before the light. I dressed inside the tent to stay warm, came out into the blue-grey pre-dawn dark, and started the stove. Low 40s, maybe 39. Frost on the tent fly. I could see my breath in the glow of my headlamp. I made coffee, set the second cup, and sat on my folding camp stool looking at the tree line while Biscuit ate his breakfast out of the collapsible dish I kept in the pack. And I found it there in that early light, the thing I had not placed. Between the flat rock where I'd been setting the cups and the first row of trees, someone had arranged a row of sticks. Not piled, arranged. Parallel to each other, 6 or 7 of them, laid with a deliberateness that the ground around them did not have. They were not sticks that had fallen in a line. Sticks don't fall in lines. They were set there by something, touching the leaf litter carefully, spacing them as if the spacing mattered. I sat with that for a long time before I stood up and went to look. The sticks were dry hemlock branches, fairly straight, about 2 feet long each. They'd been broken or snapped cleanly at both ends, not torn. The breaks were fresh, white wood at the ends. I crouched and put my hand near one without touching it, and I went through my rational inventory the way I always do, the way a man trained in procedure goes through a checklist before he concludes anything. Another volunteer? No one else had been near this edge of the camp. I would have heard footsteps on the gravel in the night, and I was a light sleeper at the best of times and had been lighter since Ruth died. Debris blown into a pattern. No wind last night, and there was no corresponding scatter in the leaves. A branch that had fallen and bounced into a series of arrangements? Not likely, and I measured the ceiling. The nearest overhead branch was a hemlock 40 feet up, and its trajectory to the ground would have dropped it 10 feet to my left. I'm not a person who believes in things I can't explain. I want to be clear about that. I believe in the explanations I can verify, and when I can't verify an explanation, I stay with the question until I can. But there was no fourth explanation that held up, and the sticks were there, arranged, and the night had been very still. Biscuit, for his part, had walked over to the sticks while I was crouching, sniffed each one in sequence, and then sat down among them with the expression of a dog who has answered a question to his own satisfaction and is ready for the day to continue. He was not alarmed, he was not excited, he was settled. If you've spent enough time with a dog you trust, you learn to weight their calm as heavily as their alarm. Biscuit's calm that morning was one of the things I kept coming back to later, on the drive home and in the days after, when I was trying to account for what happened. Carol called the morning briefing at first light, and I reported Biscuit's deviation point from the evening before as the highest priority for my second-day search. She agreed. The other teams were working the creek bottoms to the south and east, and the North Quadrant's ridge system was still clear. I took a radio, extra water, a basic first aid kit, an emergency thermal blanket, and a day's worth of food for both of us. And we went back in. Biscuit picked up the thread where he'd left it the day before. This is the thing about a dog with a genuine nose. They don't lose the work overnight. They pick it up. He moved off trail to the north again, and I followed him, and we went slower than the afternoon before because I was being careful about my footing and because I was paying attention to everything around us in a different register than the day before. Not frightened, present. The way you get when something you can't name has your attention. The woods up in that quadrant have a particular character. Ridge laurel on the south-facing slopes, hemlock along the wet draws, stands of beech that hold their pale leaves into November like they can't quite commit to letting go. The light was clean and thin, the kind of November morning light that comes at a low angle and makes everything look faintly lit from inside. I've worked in these hills for 2 seasons, and I know their particular sounds and their particular silences. And the silence I walked through that morning was the same silence as the night before. Complete. Not threatening, but complete, the way a room is when someone very large is in it and being very careful. I noticed the birds about a quarter-mile in. There were no birds. Not the absence you get when a hawk is working, which is brief and localized. This was a perimeter absence, a radius of quiet, and it moved with us as we walked. Whatever created it, I was inside it too. Biscuit slowed to a focused pace, nose working hard, tail at that same deliberate height. I stayed behind him and let him lead, and kept my mouth shut. We dropped off the ridge into a hemlock draw, followed it maybe 200 yards, and came out onto a small shelf of flat ground, sheltered on 3 sides by rock outcroppings. The kind of natural room the mountain makes sometimes, where the geology gives you walls. It caught the low sun. Compared to the open ridge, it was almost warm. Denny was sitting at the center of that shelf. He was upright, his back resting against the lowest rock, knees drawn up, hands folded in his lap. His pack was beside him. He had his shell zipped to his chin and his fleece collar turned up. He looked, from 20 feet, like a man who had sat down to eat lunch and was deciding whether to have more. When I came around the rock and he saw me, he raised one hand in a small wave, the way you'd wave to a neighbor across a yard. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I said back. I went through the assessment I was trained to do, talking to him while I looked, checking his eyes and his color, and asking him to tell me where he was and what day it was. He was disoriented on the day, thought it was still Wednesday, and he was stiff from the cold and the ground and had drunk most of his water, but he was mentally present and physically whole. No injury, no frostbite I could see. The color in his face was good. For a man who'd spent 31 hours in the November woods at low 40s overnight, he was in condition I would call inexplicably good. I called it in on the radio. Carol's voice crackled back with a quality I'd never heard in it before, which was the sound of a controlled person losing control for exactly 1 second before recovering. She told me to stay put and gave me the estimated time for the extraction team to reach us, which was going to be a while given where we were in the quadrant. While I waited, I looked at the sticks. They were hemlock branches like the ones at camp. Dry, snapped clean at both ends. Arranged around Denny's position in a rough 3-sided frame, not touching him, but placed close enough that if someone had continued the work and laid boughs over them, they'd have made a low shelter, a lean-to shape that would have kept the wind off him and held whatever warmth his body was putting out. The arrangement was not finished. It was structural, geometric, and deliberate, and it was not made by Denny. I asked him about the sticks. He looked at them and then back at me with an expression that mixed puzzlement and mild interest. "I didn't put those there," he said. "I noticed them this morning. I thought they were there when I sat down last night. Seemed like a good spot because of them." He paused. "Is that strange?" "I'm not sure yet," I said. He accepted that answer completely. He was a schoolteacher. He knew when an answer was honest. Biscuit sat down next to Denny and put his chin on the old man's knee. Denny put one hand on the dog's head without comment, the way a person does when contact is offered, and it is exactly what was needed. I sat on a rock at the edge of the shelf and looked at the sticks, and at the light coming through the hemlock, and at Biscuit's easy posture against Denny's leg. And I thought about my flat rock at base camp and the cups. I thought about the arrangement I'd found in the morning. 6 or 7 sticks, parallel, deliberate, and these sticks here, 3-sided, aimed to shelter. The same intention in both, the same careful geometry, a thing placed to hold something safe. I don't have a word for what I felt in that moment. I've been looking for one for weeks now, and the closest I can get is recognized. Not seen in the abstract. Recognized specifically. The way you feel when someone knows your name in a room where you thought you were a stranger. The extraction team reached us an hour later, 4 volunteers with a litter in case it was needed, and Denny walked out with help on the steep sections. He talked the whole way, a retired schoolteacher who'd spent a cold night in the woods and was happy to have a new story. He mentioned a warmth he'd felt during the night that he couldn't account for, given the temperature. He mentioned the sticks. He mentioned feeling, at some point in the dark, that he was not alone. He said it mattered to him. I listened, and I did not add anything. At the trailhead, the medics looked Denny over and put him in an ambulance with a foil blanket and a thermos of something hot. He was going to be fine. He was, by every measure I could apply, fine in a way that the night he'd spent should have made harder than it did. I went back to base camp after the debrief and broke down my tent. The sticks by the flat rock were still there. I hadn't moved them, and no one else had come near that corner of the camp. I stood looking at them for a while with my hands in my jacket pockets and the cold working its way in at my collar. And I thought about the tree line and the silence the night before and the silence in the woods this morning and the radius of quiet that had moved with us and the way Biscuit had sat down among those morning sticks, like they were an ordinary place to sit. I thought about how I'd been going through 2 seasons of searches with my grief packed down and converted into method, into grid protocol and compass bearings and radio procedure, into the use of skill as a way of not having to feel the size of what was empty. The searches gave me a reason to be in the woods, and the woods gave me a reason to be careful and deliberate and present in a way that ordinary days no longer asked of me. I'd thought of that as a kind of management, a way of getting through. Sitting beside Denny in that hemlock drawer, watching Biscuit rest his chin on an old man's knee, I understood something that I had been managing instead of understanding, which is that care does not require an audience. That care was not something Ruth had given me and then taken away when she left. That the geometry of sheltering, the impulse to place something deliberate around the thing you want to protect, doesn't need permission or explanation. It just needs to be done. What placed those sticks around Denny Aldrich? I don't know. I've thought about it in the way I think about mechanical problems, methodically, trying each explanation and letting it run until it fails. There is no explanation that holds. A person would have been heard or seen. The stick arrangement was too specific and too structurally sound to be the work of anything small or accidental. The fresh breaks on the wood were clean, requiring a force and precision that rules out wind or impact. What I know is that 31 hours after a 67-year-old man walked off a trail in low 40-degree November, he was found sitting upright and warm and calm in a shelter frame that someone had built and not finished. And that same someone had left a shorter version of that same intention outside my camp the night before. Parallel sticks laid with care on the frost-cold ground between where I slept and where the trees began. I've told you what I saw. I can't tell you more than that, because more than that is where my categories stop working. I loaded Biscuit into the truck and drove the county road back toward the highway. And somewhere in that drive, with the bare trees moving past the window, and the heater running, and Biscuit asleep across the passenger seat, I started thinking about Marsh. I thought about the last thing he said to me before we stopped talking, which was said in a hospital corridor in a tone I'd been storing as anger for 3 years. I'd been storing it as anger because anger was a shape that made sense and grief did not. But sitting in the truck with the heater running and a successful search behind me and the memory of those sticks laid in careful parallel outside my camp, I recognized that what Marsh had been expressing in that hospital corridor was not criticism. It was fear. The same fear I'd had. The same fear anyone has when a person they love is in a room getting smaller and there is nothing useful to do with your hands. I pulled into a gas station off the highway and sat in the parking lot for a while. Then I called Marsh. He answered on the second ring, which surprised me. I'd been prepared for voicemail. "Clayton," he said. Not a question. "Yeah," I said. There was a silence that was the 3 years sitting in the phone line between us, and then I said, "I've been out on a search. We found the person we were looking for." "That's good," he said. His voice was careful the way a person's voice is careful when they've been waiting for a call and don't want to show how long they've been waiting. "Marsh," I said, and then I didn't have the rest of the sentence for a few seconds. "I think I've been wrong about what happened, about what I decided, about how I talked to you." He was quiet. "I'm not sure I'm wrong," I said, "but I think I've been carrying it wrong. Ruth would have thought I was carrying it wrong." I heard him breathe. "She probably would have," he said. "I'd like to talk to you," I said. "Not on the phone, if you're willing." "I'm willing," he said. Just that, without qualification. We stayed on the phone another minute or two, not saying much. Working out a rough plan to meet in a few weeks. His town or mine didn't matter. When we hung up, I sat in the parking lot a little longer with my hand on the steering wheel and the engine running, and Biscuit awake now, watching me with his brown eyes, that steady, patient look that doesn't ask you to be any particular way. "All right," I said to him. "Let's go home." The weeks between that search and now have had a different quality than the 3 years before. Not better in the way that means painless. Better in the way that means the load has shifted on the truck, the weight redistributed, and the truck handles different on the road. Ruth is still gone. The kitchen still feels larger than it did when she was in it. But I've stopped managing the grief with method and started letting it be the size it actually is, which is the size of 24 years, which is considerable and which does not require me to minimize it in order to get through the day. Marsh and I met at a diner roughly halfway between our two towns on a Saturday 3 weeks after the search. We sat for nearly 3 hours. We talked about Ruth and about what happened and about what we each thought we'd been doing and what we each thought the other had been doing. And most of it was imprecise the way these conversations are, both of us reaching for something across a table that words only partially carry. At one point he put his hand on the back of mine on the table, just briefly, the way our father used to do when he was trying to communicate something he didn't have words for. I did not pull my hand away. That was new. I never told Marsh about the sticks, not that day and not yet. I don't know if I will. I know what I saw and I know what it meant to me, and some things hold their meaning better when they're carried quietly. I told you, though. Whoever you are sitting with this, I told you, and that's something. Carol called me 2 weeks after the search to ask if I was planning to re-up for the next season. I told her yes, without pausing to think about it. She said Biscuit was welcome to keep coming along, certified or not, because a good nose was a good nose, and the county wasn't going to argue with results. I said I'd pass that along to him. He didn't seem surprised. This morning, I came out before light, the way I do. November is mostly gone now, and December has come in cold and clear, the kind of cold that makes the stars look close and sharp. I made coffee on the stove, 2 cups, the way I always do. I set them on the porch rail where the flat railing board makes a wide enough shelf to hold both of them, and I sat in the old wooden chair that still has the shape of the person who sat in it most. And Biscuit came out and put himself at my feet and went back to sleep, his slow, warm weight against my boot. The tree line at the edge of the property stands the way it always has, dark and patient, the hemlocks black against the pale sky, the beeches with their last few leaves still holding on the way they do. I sat and watched it and drank my coffee while the second cup went cold beside me. And I felt, in the way I've felt it since the search, something at the edge of hearing that might have been wind and might have been something else, something I don't have a name for and have stopped needing one. I still set 2 cups out. I think I'll keep doing that for a while.